Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, president of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also an active and proud member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this time, we look at the week's anniversaries in the history of free thought, atheism, agnosticism, secularism, humanism, skepticism, rationalism, what have youism. We discuss notable people, the famous and the not so, who were born or died or achieved something significant in regards free thought during this calendar week. And we look at significant events that took place this week in history: court cases, publishing events, religious riots, burnings at the stake, and other fun. Let's start this evening with three of the biggest names in free thought: Freud, Marx, and Huxley. Sigmund Freud was born May 6th in 1856 in Moravia, in Central Europe, and where he grew up in Vienna, where he lived until he had to flee the Nazis in 1938. After earning his medical degree, he turned his thoughts to what would later be called psychiatry, and he developed his theories of psychoanalysis and basically changed the world and the way we all think about humanity, human behavior, and what goes on between our ears. Freud not only was a psychiatric or psychological pioneer, he was an active, I don't know if we could say basically atheist, but certainly free thought. In The Future, which is his masterpiece, Critique of Religion, he postulated that God is a projection of childish father figure preoccupations, that prayer and religious rituals are obsessive compulsive, and that religion is a universal neurosis, quote unquote, a universal neurosis. He followed up The Future of an Illusion in 1938 with a monumental book, Moses and Monotheism, which he directly confronted some of the basic myths of the religion with which he grew up. And he wrote that religion's doctrines carry with them the stamp of the times in which they originated, the ignorant childhood days of the human race. Its consolations deserve no trust. This is particularly important to me personally, because I wrote my first paper as a philosophy major in college a long time ago on Moses and monotheism, and I was pretty critical of it. I called it dancing on one toe. That I thought he had taken one small idea and, built it into a big theory, which I didn't think held much water. However, the point was, as far as we're concerned, that Freud challenged the concept of religion, and instead of looking at religion's rational underpinnings, he looked at its irrational motivations, its position as a universal neurosis. Religion, a childhood neurosis. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, born on May 6th. And an older freethinker was Karl Marx, who was born on May 5th in 1818. Marx's family was really a long line of rabbis, but Marx's father in the Prussian Rhineland, where the family lived, converted to Protestantism shortly before Karl's birth. Karl Marx had an extended education in various German universities, and he founded the first socialist newspaper of arts in 1844 in Paris. The Prussian government got on the French, and Marx was kicked out of Paris, banished in absentia in Prussia, and so he moved to Brussels and eventually founded the Communist League in 1847, published the very well-known Communist Manifesto, along with Engels. And after the failed revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848 and raised a lot of people's, the whole of humanity's hopes for more decent societies in 19th century Europe, after those revolutions all collapsed on themselves, Marx moved to London, and where he lived the rest of his life. Marx was a freethinker and an avowed atheist, but as Bertrand Russell later pointed out about Marx, he substituted one religion for another. He gave up the religion of his childhood, the Protestantism of his father, and the Jewish religion of his long line of ancestors. But as Russell wrote, Marx's belief that there is a cosmic force called dialectical materialism, which governs human history independently of human volitions, is mere mythology. And I think it's a pretty good point. And Marx is certainly not responsible for the horrors of Stalinist Russia, but there is no question that the communism, if you can call it communism, rather than simply totalitarianism, that ruled the Soviet Union from the mid-20s until around 1990, was a substitute for religion. It was state religion. It may have been called atheism. It was religion. And religion, Marx himself had written, is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the feelings of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of unspiritual conditions. It is the opium of the people. Very famous phrase. And the first requisite of the happiness of the people, Marx wrote, is the abolition of religion. On May 4th in 1825, Thomas Henry Huxley, M.D., the man who would later be called Darwin's bulldog, was born. I'd like to read something of his just to give you a flavor of who the man was. In matters of the intellect, he wrote, follow your reason as far as it'll take you, without any other consideration. And negatively, in matters of the intellect, do not pretend that conclusions are certain which are not demonstrated or demonstrable. The quote is from his book called Agnosticism, and Huxley was the man who coined the term agnostic. There just hadn't been a term for people who doubted the existence of God or doubted the concepts of religion, but who were not themselves atheists. Huxley was a doctor. He spent his youth exploring science, especially zoology and anatomy, and which led him to eagerly read Darwin's works when they first came out. Of course, Darwin's works were The Origin of Species was inflamed the Christian establishment in England, and for that matter all over the world. The concept that God had not created man and woman in the Garden of Eden. And Huxley, very famously, in the later 19th century, engaged in a series of debates which earned him the nickname Darwin's Bulldog, most famously with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce in Oxford. And Wilberforce made the terrible mistake of assuming that he would just wipe the floor with this upstart, and that the audience at Oxford would stand up and cheer when Wilberforce defended the biblical interpretation of the birth of humanity. So he, in a very famous snide comment or question, he asked Huxley which side of Huxley's family contained the ape that he was descended from. And Huxley took him apart in his response and replied that he would prefer to descend from an ape than from a human being who used his intellect for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into grave scientific discussion. Of course, in the long run, Huxley won the debate, except for certain parts of the United States of America, unfortunately, over 130 or 40 years later. But he published widely, including the book Agnosticism and Christianity in 1889, and he was the father of a very distinguished family. His grandsons included three famous rationalists themselves: Sir Julian Huxley, a biologist, the novelist Aldous Huxley, and Henry Fielding Huxley, the co-winner of the 1963 Nobel Prize, which he and Huxley himself received the first Darwin Medal in 1894. Defining agnosticism, he said, "Skepticism is the highest duty, and blind faith the one unpardonable sin." Freud, Marx, Huxley, three of the grandest names in the history of free thought, and we celebrate them all this first week in May. In a sort of, what will we call it, serio-comic situation in the United States in 1925, on May 5th, a biology teacher named John Scopes was arrested in Dayton, Tennessee for teaching evolution. The famous Scopes trial developed a few months later. By the way, there was never any question of guilt or innocence. Scopes was guilty of breaking the Tennessee law, which specifically forbade teachers from teaching evolution. And that's, of course, what he was trying to challenge. And the whole thing became quite famous from the writings of one of the most popular newspaper columnists of the day, H.L. Mencken, who considered everybody who didn't live in a big city, listen to Wagnerian opera, and read weighty philosophical tomes, part of what Mencken called the bourgeoisie. But Mencken had a field day, had a great time writing about the boobs in Tennessee. Bryan, by the way, was not such a bad guy. He was a biblical literalist, and he was and he did defend the Tennessee law. But Bryan was also a very serious politician who defended American small farmers from the encroachment of big business and from the banks that would strangle them with usurious interest rates. Bryan was not all bad. He was on the wrong side in this one. And of course, 50 years later, or 40 years later, along came the play and subsequently the movie Inherit the Wind, which is very much an outlandish dramatization of what actually took place in the courtroom. But it certainly has reached millions of Americans who would never have known about the small-minded people, the small-minded law and officials in Tennessee who tried to stop the teaching of evolution, and did. Of course, Scopes was convicted, and of course, he was not allowed to teach evolution, and of course, but it woke up an awful lot of people in America to what was going on. Okay. Not such big names in the history of atheism, but of interest to us, I would say. Aimez-vous Brahms, as the novel, as the French novel wrote? Well, Johannes Brahms, the composer, born May 7th in 1833, was a free thinker, a liberal who campaigned against anti-Semitism, which is a very, very big question in the 19th century in Central Europe. And he supported himself as a teenager trying to get a musical education by playing piano for drunken sailors in a Hamburg bar. And he could do that, well, not even thinking about it. He would prop up books of poetry to read on the, prop them up on the piano, to read as a diversion while he was banging away on the piano. And his favorite poet was the anti-clerical G.F. Dahmer, who was described by the Catholic Encyclopedia as an enemy of Christianity. He was a free thinker in religion, said his biographer. Music was Brahms' religion. And he was a humanist and agnostic, and lived a very sickness and illness-free life until very suddenly getting liver cancer at the age of 64 and died very quickly, but there was no deathbed conversion. His biography, as a matter of fact, is called Music Was His Religion. Brahms, the Free Thinker, who, by the way, said, Brahms, who, by the way, said, the only true immortality lies in one's children. As someone with 4 children, I think he's right. On May 7th in 1812, Robert Browning was born, the poet who is most famously known for running off with Elizabeth Barrett against the wishes of her family, and who considered her an invalid and never even let her out of the house. And he took off with her, and they ran away to Italy, had a very loving marriage, produced several children. No, they just the one child. And she didn't last all that long, but she enjoyed her life. And the Brownings were 2 of the most well-loved poets of the 19th century. Browning was a free thinker and a follower of the Unitarian minister Fox, W.J. Fox, and he had an ambivalent attitude towards religion. Basically, he didn't like it, but he didn't come straight out and say, I don't believe in God. He just didn't like religion. Welcome to the club, Robert Browning. Much more contemporary for us is the actor George Clooney, who was born May 6th, 1961. And our friends at the Freedom from Religion Foundation have dug up this quote. George Clooney said, I don't believe in heaven and hell. I don't know if I believe in God. All I know is that as an individual, I won't allow this life, the only thing I know to exist, to be wasted. Well, George Clooney is certainly not wasting his life as an actor, as a director, as a producer of some of the better films of the last 10 or 15 years. George Clooney's doing all right, and doing all right without God. Joe Heller. Joseph Heller, the novelist who was born on May 1st in 1923, was someone I knew not terribly close, but he was childhood and lifelong best friend of the novelist George Mandel, who is my ex-uncle. An ex-uncle is the uncle of your ex-wife, which is how George and I are not still related. Joseph Heller was as funny in person as he was in his books. His family in Coney Island, in Brooklyn, in the 20s and 30s, was not religious, ethnically Jewish, but they didn't attend synagogue. And Joe was brought up as a free thinker. And Barbara Gelb wrote in a New York Times article in 1975 about the family. She said that Heller was not bar mitzvahed at 13, and I don't guess he ever was. And Lena Heller, his mother, she wrote, was no more religiously inclined than her husband had been, but she was insecure about her nonconformity and attempted to conceal it. And Joe Heller himself told Gelb, "My mother used to try to get me to dress neatly on Saturday, even though none of us ever went to synagogue, except, I guess, once a year on Yom Kippur. I remember once I embarrassed her terribly, on purpose, by yelling up to her from the street, 'Hey, Ma, throw me down a ham sandwich.'" Joe died in 1999, and I love this quote of his about whether there is a God. "Good God," he wrote, "how much reverence can you have for a supreme being who finds it necessary to include such phenomena as phlegm and tooth decay in his divine system of creation?" Joseph Heller, who went through a period of several years where he never let anyone into his apartment who was not carrying pizza, and who died in 1999, a free thinker, a funny man, and Catch-22. One of the classic novels of the American English language that's going to last for a long, long time. So, the first week in May in atheist history, the birth dates of Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Thomas Henry Huxley. The anniversary on May 5th of the arrest of John Scopes in 1925. We look back also at Johannes Brahms and Robert Browning, and we mention the free thought ideas of our contemporaries, George Clooney and Joe Heller. I hope you'll return with us, come back next week when we'll be discussing the second week in May with the important dates around such figures as the physicist Richard Feynman, the songwriter Irving Berlin, there's a surprise, little lesser known people like Ella E. Gibson and Robert Owen, but also some other big names like Katharine Hepburn, Florence Nightingale, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and my favorite next week, George Carlin. This has been this week in Atheist History. I'm John Rafferty, and I hope I see you again here, or rather you see us again here next week. Good night.
We once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.